Hello there and welcome back to the channel and another voyage kind of into the mirror universe. One of my personal favorite subject matters. Recently, in the current adventure of the USS Discovery, we actually encountered a mirror universe warship, the ISS Enterprise. Now, this is a vessel that we've covered the lore on this channel before, but I ain't throwing away an opportunity to go over it again because it's the Terran Empire, which is very close to my heart as a institution. Thematically, I think they're more likely to be our future than the Prime Universe, quite frankly. But anyway, with that, before we get started on that, please like, share, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts on the Mirror Universe and the recent appearance of the ISS Enterprise, as I have enough thoughts that I had to write them down this time because I had a few questions as well as observations and things about the ship that I do like. But let's get into it. Quick overview of the ship itself. The ISS Enterprise was the Imperial flagship of the Imperial Starfleet of the Terran Empire in the so-called Mirror Universe. It is a Constitution-class battlecruiser commanded, when we first encountered it, by Captain James Tiberius Kirk, one of the most ruthless and savage captains in Starfleet, known to have assassinated his predecessor, Christopher Pike, in order to take his position as captain, which, despite how prevalent this seems to be in the Mirror Universe as a method of advancement, it's not quite so simplistic as I kill you, I get your job, because it just wouldn't function. All that we have seen in the Mirror Universe states that that is a possible way to advance your career, but it might not be a good one. It really depends on whether you're in favor with the people higher up than you and whether they weren't. So there can be consequences for such actions, but that's all besides the point. In basic layout and structure, a Constitution-class warship is very similar to a Constitution-class starship like the USS Enterprise. Although we don't know the exact differences, we can make certain suppositions based on what we have seen of the capabilities of Terran counterpart vessels of other classes. It will be more heavily armed. The weapons themselves will be of a higher caliber. It will have stronger shields. It will be made of a more dense hull armor. It will be more armor plated, for that matter. So structurally more sound, more built for combat. Although superficially the vessels look similar, their interior layouts are near identical but a bit different. But in the circuitry and the basic workings of the ships, they're different. For example, the way they prioritize power for the Terran ship will be towards life support and weapons, whereas in the Prime Universe it'll be life support and engines and sensors. The Terrans always prioritize combat system over all other things on their ships, giving them, of course, a more militaristic feel, despite the fact that they superficially are similar. They also likely have more weapons emplacement, not to mention the weapons themselves being of a different grade. So we saw, for example, with the ISS Enterprise of the NX class cruisers, they had pulse phaser weapons as well as beam. So that was a big difference over its Prime Universe counterpart, far more heavily armed with more destructive weapons. They were also near invulnerable to Tholian vessels at the time, able to take a hell of a pounding compared to the NX class starship of the Prime Universe, which couldn't do that. So there are big differences in certain levels of their technology, particularly in combat. But on the other hand, the Prime Universe has certain advantages in other areas. For example, engines. Engines being a very good one, although Terran ships are probably just as quick. The engines are nowhere near as stable or as safe as those utilized by the Prime Universe. So those are the basics of these ships. So what do we know about the fate of the ISS Enterprise? Of course, there are alternative universe explanations as to what happened to it, which are, shall we say, third-party, non-defined, potentially not exactly true. But we do now know, canonically, that Kirk's ship and Pike's ship, ISS Enterprise, ended up in the Prime Universe working as a refugee ship, for lack of a better term. The crew abandoned ship by shuttlecraft and escape pods. They used some kind of spatial phenomena to get into the universe. The ship got stuck and couldn't get itself out, and they got out of the anomaly utilizing other features. We even know that one of them, at least, ended up joining Starfleet in the Prime Universe. Whether or not Starfleet knew she was a Terran is debatable, although Empress Georgiou was employed into Section 31, so they're not entirely against it. And it's nice to see that tolerance and, this idea that just because you come from a violent culture, like Worf, for example, doesn't mean you're inherently a violent person. You can still thrive in an institution like Starfleet and the Federation. So it was good to see that. But there are several questions I have about this ship, which we're going to try and go over. And I don't really have answers to these, but they are questions that come up. Out of universe, get it out of the way. Burnham and Book went aboard the ship. They clearly just used a redressing of the set from Strange New Worlds to make it the Terran version of that same ship. That's purely what they did, and that's why it looks like Pike's ship. The first question, though, that raises to me is we encounter the vessel when it was commanded by Kirk, which had clearly been refitted and looked quite different to that. So that brings up the question of, is this an earlier version of the ISS Enterprise that in the Mirror Universe was decommissioned and then recommissioned for various reasons, likely the fall of the Empire, and used as a refugee ship, or did it get refitted back to original specifications after Kirk? Or is there some other explanation as to why this ship still looks like basically its 2250s version rather than its 2260s version? It was the first question that came into my head. It also has a knock-on question of the Empire fell in the late 23rd century, probably in the 2290s. By that point, the Enterprise B should have been in service. Never mind the Enterprise A. This is the original Constitution class pre-refit. Assuming the Terran Empire followed suit, as it often does so closely with starship designs in their universe, there should have been, by this point, an Enterprise A at the fall of the Empire, because that's when the ship left. And there should have been an Enterprise B. Now, it's possible neither ship was ever built. That is possible. But as the two universes seem very close in a lot of other ways, it seems unlikely that at the very least the Enterprise A would have never been built. But yet this ship was at its original specifications at a period after we saw it under Kirk's command. There is also possibly some wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff going on, because we don't really, as yet of the upload of this video, know the fate of Empress Georgiou when she returned. Is it possible that the Terran Empire actually doesn't fall anymore? That what we saw was more of a continuity of events, maybe with a bit of a disruption, and that's why this ship hasn't had its refit to Kirk's specifications anymore, because it's actually still under the command of Pike. It's possible. So, as I said, a couple of other questions that kind of popped into my head. We hear in dialogue that the Chancellor of the Terran Empire was killed for attempting to implement reforms. Now, the reason that stood out to me as a sentence, first of all, why did anyone bother to update the plaque on the ship? That kind of half went through my mind, and I'll be honest, I actually watched the Trek Culture episode recently where he mentioned the same thing, and I was like, that really? I mean, why? How? They're refugees. What are they bothering updating a plaque on the ship for? Why not just put it as a log? And we're going to get to that, actually, the crew and everything in a moment. But Spock, we can assume that person was Spock. We don't know that for a certainty, because he's meant to have ascended to the role of Emperor, maybe. I'm hearing a slight change in circumstances and events. Spock became captain after he got rid of Kirk, for however he did that, and he then tried to implement reforms, and that caused the fall of the Terran Empire because of invasion, not because he was killed. The Empire was invaded by the Klingon-Cardassian alliance, which ultimately destroyed it. So, if Spock was killed for implementing reforms, had those reforms actually fully been implemented, had the Empire fallen, I mean, I suppose there wouldn't be a need for a refugee ship if it hadn't, or wasn't at least under attack or danger of such thing. But there's still a couple of open questions. I think the Empire is still meant to fall. I'm just wondering if there's been a slight change in the timeline, because we know in the Prime Universe, the whole 21st century timeline has been slightly skewed. Things like the eugenics wars, things like that have all been altered just slightly, with the exception of set points in time, like First Contact. But generally speaking, it's possible there could have been a knock-on effect to the mirror universe as well, possibly something relating to Giorgio returning to said universe, causing a change, which could mean the Empire doesn't fall, it just reforms, or because they killed Spock, did they undo his changes and actually save the Empire? Because let's face it, the only reason the Empire fell is because Spock made his reforms and weakened the Empire and made it vulnerable to its enemies, races they'd been basically killing for centuries, either rose up against them or invaded because they were so sick of the Terrans. He left them in that position. The Federation may have been a good idea, but we should point out that it was mentioned in the 22nd century by those that studied the Federation database in the USS Defiant that they didn't know if a Federation would work in the mirror universe. The universes are superficially similar but very different. Saval mentions it in the mirror universe, the mirror version of Saval, that he doesn't know that if something like the Federation could ever exist in the Terran universe because of just the nature of the races that live there, particularly the Terrans. But I suppose it's possible. This does bring me to my next two sort of thoughts I had about the ISS Enterprise. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely loved seeing the Enterprise. I love anything to do with the mirror universe. First of all, what happened to the crew? The refugees, they abandoned ship. They're somewhere. I'm assuming we'll one day get an explanation. Might not even be in Discovery. It could be in a later series. Another series of Prodigy. Another series set in the 22nd century. It could even be carried on in some, maybe a follow-up to Picard or one of the others. Someone could explain what happened to the crew of the ISS Enterprise, or at least the refugees. But the actual crew, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Uhura, where did they go? Now, I understand why they didn't mention them in the show, other than a slight wink. But again, referencing that Trek Culture episode, he mentions the same thing that I'm sort of thinking. Why use the Enterprise if you're not going to use the Enterprise's crew for a bit of, fan baiting or Easter eggs? There's nothing. There's nothing. There's no reference to them. They're not mentioned. They're not seen. There's no images. I half expected, and I was really, really hoping, we would actually meet Mirror Spock. Maybe he survived and he was in a stasis chamber, a modified, agony booth or something, turned into a stasis chamber or something on the ship, and they'd meet Mirror Spock. I was kind of hoping that would happen. It didn't. He'd escaped an assassination attempt as the Empire fell aboard this ship with others, but they got left behind because, he's a reason for the fall. Who knows? I kind of hoped for that. Didn't see it happen, but I was optimistic. But anyway, what happened to the actual crew of the Enterprise is something I'm curious about. I'm curious also to see if we're going to see explanation with that in a later episode. Maybe something that will be defined, either in Season 5 of Discovery or, as I said, in a spin-off show. At this point, it'll probably have to be in a spin-off of some kind, because I don't think they're going to revisit it in the few episodes they've got left of Discovery. But the Enterprise, the ISS Enterprise, does survive, and it shoots off to be taken to a starbase for study and preservation and restoration, or whatever they're going to do with it. The next question I had was, why the Enterprise at all? Because, like I said, if you're not going to use the crew, why bring the Enterprise over? Why not, as an alternative, bring over the ISS Defiant? Because I really liked the symmetry idea that the USS Defiant was pulled into that universe via a spatial anomaly, spatial phenomena created by the Tholians, doesn't matter. It ended up in the mirror universe and became the flagship, temporarily at least, of the Terran Empire in that universe. There's a certain poetic symmetry if the ISS Defiant of the 23rd century then also found its way to the Prime universe, like the two ships just did a straight, switch. So the ISS Defiant, around the same time period, because based on designs, it's from roughly the same, it's from the 2260s era, 2250s, 2260s, made the leap over, and that would have taken out all the questions of, well, why is the bridge different? Why is this ship not why does the ship not look like Kirk's ship did? Because the ISS Defiant, for all we goddamn well know, but at that point could have still had that layout. It may have never had a refit, may have never been changed, or whatever happened to make the ship go from point A to point B from the 50s to the 60s. So why not use that ship? Or any other? It didn't have to be a vessel we knew. It could have been the ISS Purgatory. It could have been the ISS Hades, the ISS Warspite. It could have given it any name, but no, it had to be the Enterprise, which I kind of understand, but at the same time, I was like, but you've introduced a lot of open-ended questions, which, if you're not going to answer them, is very frustrating. But that's sort of my take on this, and it's mostly, I know, an opinion piece rather than necessarily lore. But to be honest, it doesn't really add much to the Enterprise's lore, because we still don't know what happened to the crew and the ship between the events of Mirror Mirror and the fall of the Terran Empire. We have bits and pieces of information, but nothing, shall we say, alpha canon that goes from between those points. So all, basically, to put it bluntly, all the books and stuff, they don't count. At least not to me, because I don't cover beta canon. So if it's not seen on screen, we got nothing, and they never really mention what happened to this ship after those events. So there's a lot of open-ended questions this has given us, which I'm hoping will get resolutions either in future episodes of Discovery, or a future Star Trek series, or in one of the current Star Trek series, or a short trek or something that will explain what happened to the refugees, what happened to the crew, how the ship ended up a refugee ship, etc. Lots of questions, want some answers. That is the end of this video anyway. If you made it all the way to the end of it, I thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.